The courtroom was too quiet. The kind of quiet that made the air feel heavy, like something was about to snap. I stood there, hands resting on the table in front of me, watching Judge Robertson flip through a stack of papers. He wasn't in a hurry. He wanted me to wait. People always think silence is nothing, but it isn't. Silence can be a weapon. Silence can be a game. I'd seen it before, men in power using quiet to make the other side sweat. It didn't work on me. Mr. Vance, he finally said, setting the papers down. He didn't look at me yet, just smoothed his robe like he was brushing off dust. I assume you know why you're standing here today. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know, I did, but because the way he said it made it sound like I was on trial. Like I had done something wrong. But I wasn't the one who messed up. I do. Your Honor, I said carefully. He lifted his eyes to mine. They were dark, steady. Then you must also know that this court has no patience for theatrics. I didn't flinch. I wouldn't waste the court's time like that. Robertson made a small sound, something between a scoff and a breath, then glanced at the other lawyer, Calloway, a man with a perfect suit and a smirk that hadn't left his face since we walked in. Calloway wasn't nervous. He thought this was already decided. I had seen that smirk before, too. Robertson tapped his fingers on the bench. Mr. Calloway, would you like to begin? With pleasure, Your Honor, Calloway said, standing up. He adjusted his tie like he was getting ready for a performance. And that's exactly what it was. A performance. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, turning just enough to face the courtroom. What we have here today is not a complicated matter. It is not a matter of opinion or interpretation or even, dare I say, discussion. It is simply a matter of law. He walked slowly, deliberately, like he wanted to make sure every pair of eyes followed him. And the law is clear. The actions of Mr. Vance, he paused, turning to me with that same smirk, are in direct violation of court procedure. There are rules, and he broke them. I kept my face neutral. I had expected this. Calloway was a man who loved easy victories. He thought if he said something with enough confidence, it became the truth. Now, Calloway continued, looking back at Robertson, I understand that Mr. Vance is passionate about his case. And I understand that passion can sometimes lead people to overstep. He placed a hand on his chest, like he was talking about an old friend who had lost their way. Like he wasn't trying to bury me right then and there. But, Your Honor, passion does not change the law. And the law is what we must respect. He turned back to his table, sitting down smoothly. That is all. Judge Robertson nodded. Thank you, Mr. Calloway. Then his eyes were on me again. Mr. Vance, I didn't rush. I had spent years learning that the first words out of your mouth mattered. People don't remember everything you say. They remember how you start, how you end, and how you make them feel in between. I took a breath. Your Honor, if I may clarify, you may not. The gavel struck wood, sharp and sudden. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Robertson leaned forward. I have heard enough. This court does not tolerate disregard for its authority. And because of your repeated attempts to sidestep proper procedure, I am issuing a fine of $10,000 for contempt. There it was. The gavel came down again, final and heavy. I felt the weight of every eye in the room pressing in, waiting to see how I would react. $10,000. Not just a punishment. A message. A message that said, sit down. Be quiet. Take your loss and leave. But I wasn't leaving. I met Robertson's stare, steady. Your Honor, I'd like to challenge that fine. The courtroom went silent again, but this time, it was different. This time, people weren't just waiting. They were watching. Robertson frowned. On what grounds? I straightened. On the grounds that you just violated due process. A ripple went through the crowd. It was faint, but I caught it. The shift in energy, the tiny moment where people started to wonder if they were seeing something more than they expected. Robertson blinked. Just once. Excuse me. I kept my voice calm. Your Honor, I respectfully submit that this fine is not only unjust, but unlawful. Calloway's smirk finally slipped. I wasn't supposed to fight back, but I just had. The judge's eyes stayed on me, but his fingers twitched against the bench. The silence stretched just long enough for people to notice. Then he leaned forward. Mr. Vance, You are aware that challenging a ruling without proper cause can result in further penalties, yes? I nodded. I am. Then explain yourself. His voice was calm, but there was something else underneath. A thread of irritation, maybe even curiosity. I glanced at Calloway. He had leaned back in his chair, one hand resting against his chin like he was watching a child struggle with a math problem. I turned back to Robertson. Your Honor, this fine was issued without a proper hearing. That is a direct violation of my right to due process. Robertson's mouth pressed into a thin line. You were given an opportunity to speak just now. An opportunity, yes, I said, but not a fair one. I was not permitted to present my argument before a punishment was decided. And in issuing a fine of this amount, the court has effectively ruled against me without allowing me to defend myself. Calloway sighed, shaking his head. Your Honor, this is nonsense. Robertson held up a hand, stopping him. His eyes stayed on me. Are you saying I acted unlawfully? I met his stare. Yes, Your Honor. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted in their seat. Robertson's fingers stopped tapping. You have some nerve, Mr. Vance. I kept my expression even. I have respect for the law, Your Honor. His jaw tightened. Then, after a beat, he nodded. Fine. You want to challenge the fine? Do it properly. Present your argument. That was all I needed. I stepped forward, letting the room settle. Your Honor, let's start with the most basic principle. A judge's authority is not limitless. It is constrained by law, just as every citizen's actions are constrained by it. And one of the most fundamental rights of any individual is the right to a fair process before a punishment is issued. Robertson didn't move. Now, I continued, pacing slightly. Let's consider what just happened. I was accused of violating court procedure. No warning, no formal charge. And then, without an evidentiary hearing, I was fined $10,000. I stopped, looked straight at him. Your Honor, what case law justifies that? A pause. Then, slowly, Robertson sat back. His face was unreadable, but something about the shift in his posture told me he wasn't as sure of himself as he had been 5 minutes ago. He turned to his clerk. Bring me the case files for Reynolds versus State and Parker versus Hudson. I had been waiting for that. The clerk nodded and rushed to gather the documents. Calloway let out a quiet chuckle. Oh, come on, he muttered. This is a waste of time. I didn't look at him. I was watching Robertson, because right now, he was doing what every judge does when they start to suspect they made a mistake. He was stalling. The courtroom was dead silent again. Then the clerk returned, handing Robertson a few papers. He scanned them quickly, flipping through pages faster than he probably needed to. I already knew what he'd find. His fingers stopped. His eyes flickered across the words. Then he slowly looked up at me. Mr. Vance. His voice was different now. Less firm, more careful. Are you suggesting that my ruling contradicts established precedent? I didn't hesitate. I'm not suggesting, Your Honor. I'm stating it as fact. A few gasps rippled through the room. Even Calloway sat up straighter. Robertson stared at me. For the first time since I'd stepped into this courtroom, he looked unsure. And that was when I knew the room felt different now. The quiet wasn't just quiet anymore. It was waiting, watching. Even the air felt heavier, like everyone in the courtroom had leaned forward just a little, careful not to miss what would happen next. Judge Robertson still had the papers in his hand, but he wasn't looking at them anymore. He was looking at me. His grip tightened slightly, barely noticeable, but I caught it. Mr. Vance, he said slowly, you claim my ruling contradicts precedent. I nodded. Yes, Your Honor. He let the words settle, then leaned forward. Explain. I stepped toward the table, keeping my movements measured. I had been in enough rooms like this to know how fast power could shift. One wrong step, one miscalculated word, and I could lose all of it. Reynolds versus State, I began. That case established that a financial penalty imposed by a court must be preceded by a hearing where the accused is given a meaningful opportunity to respond. I gestured slightly toward the papers in his hand. That ruling was reaffirmed in Parker versus Hudson, where the appellate court overturned a contempt fine on the basis that the defendant had not been given a fair chance to argue their case. Robertson's jaw tightened slightly. He already knew I was right. The question now was whether he would admit it. Calloway let out a sharp breath. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. Robertson didn't look at him. Is it? For the first time, Calloway hesitated. His confidence flickered just for a moment. Yes, he said quickly. Mr. Vance is taking these cases out of context. They do not apply to this situation. I turned toward him. How so? Calloway smirked, but didn't reach his eyes. Reynolds and Parker both dealt with penalties that were issued outside the immediate supervision of the court. The rulings were about ensuring fairness when a judge wasn't personally overseeing the proceedings. He turned to Robertson now, shoulders squaring like he had just regained his footing. But that's not what happened here, Your Honor. You issued the fine directly, in open court, with full awareness of Mr. Vance's actions. That is well within your authority. He sat back, satisfied. A few people in the audience murmured in agreement. It was a good argument, a strong one. Calloway knew the law well enough to twist it in his favor. Unfortunately for him, I knew it better. I nodded slowly, like I was considering his point. Then I turned back to the judge. Your Honor, may I respond? Robertson gestured for me to continue. Mr. Calloway is correct about one thing, I said. Those cases did involve penalties issued outside of direct court supervision. But he's ignoring the most important part of both rulings, the principle they were based on. I took a step closer. It doesn't matter whether a fine is issued in open court or behind closed doors. What matters is whether the accused was given a fair opportunity to present a defense before being punished. I paused for just a second, letting my next words land exactly how I wanted them to. And I wasn't. The silence that followed was louder than anything Calloway could have said. Robertson didn't speak right away. His fingers tapped once against the desk, then twice. Then they stopped. He turned to his clerk. Find me the full transcripts for Reynolds and Parker. Now. The clerk nodded and rushed out of the room. Calloway's smirk was gone. His jaw clenched slightly, but he forced himself to stay still. I exhaled slowly. I had just done something most lawyers wouldn't dare try. I had made a judge doubt himself, and I wasn't done yet. The clerk rushed back into the room, a stack of papers clutched tightly in his hands. His breath was uneven, like he had just sprinted through the halls to get them as fast as possible. He handed them to Judge Robertson, who took his time adjusting them on the bench, flipping through the pages. No one spoke. I stood still, watching the judge's expression carefully. He wasn't rushing anymore. He wasn't dismissing my argument. He was reading, processing. Then, slowly, he set the papers down. He exhaled through his nose. I knew that look. It was the look of a man realizing he had made a mistake. Robertson straightened. Mr. Vance, he said, his voice measured, you have presented an interesting interpretation of these cases. I nodded slightly. I knew what was coming next. But, he continued, this court does not operate on interpretations alone. The law is not just a collection of words. It is context. It is precedent. It is the discretion of the court. I didn't react. I let him keep speaking. That being said, Robertson continued, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk, I acknowledge that a further review of this matter is warranted. The court will take a brief recess. A murmur rippled through the audience. I could see people shifting in their seats, exchanging glances. This wasn't a victory, not yet. But it also wasn't the dismissal Robertson had been aiming for. He wasn't ready to admit he was wrong, but he wasn't sure he was right either. That was enough. For now, Robertson struck his gavel against the bench. Court is in recess for 20 minutes. Then he stood and walked out. The moment he was gone, the tension in the room finally cracked. Quiet conversations broke out between the spectators. Some were whispering, others were bolder. I didn't move. I could feel Calloway's eyes on me. You really think you've got him, don't you? His voice was quieter now, but there was an edge to it. I turned to face him. I think the law is clear. Calloway scoffed. You think a few precedents are going to make Robertson back down? He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. I've been in his courtroom for years. I know how he works. He doesn't like being challenged, Vance. He doesn't like losing control. If you think he's just going to roll over because you found a couple of cases that don't even perfectly align, you're more naive than I thought. I studied him for a moment. You sound nervous, I said. Calloway's smirk faltered, just for a second. Then he shook his head and turned away, pretending to focus on his notes. I exhaled slowly. I had seen doubt creeping into Robertson's face, into his voice. But Calloway was right about one thing. This judge was not the kind of man who liked being proven wrong. I had forced him to pause. Now, I had to make sure he couldn't ignore what he had just realized. 20 minutes. And then, we'd see if Robertson was ready to admit the truth. The courtroom doors swung open, and Judge Robertson walked back in. His expression was unreadable, but his steps were slower than before, more deliberate. Whatever he had done during the recess, it hadn't given him confidence. It had given him caution. The conversations in the room died down instantly. Everyone was waiting. I adjusted my tie, keeping my posture steady. This was the moment. Robertson took his seat, straightened his robe, and tapped his gavel once. Court is back in session. Silence. Then he exhaled through his nose. During the recess, I reviewed the case law presented by Mr. Vance. I also took the time to consult additional legal precedent regarding judicial discretion in contempt rulings. I didn't move. I already knew what was coming. Robertson looked down at his papers, flipping through them as if searching for something. Then he set them aside. "Mr. Vance," he said, locking eyes with me, "your argument is well prepared. However, this court maintains the authority to issue penalties in cases of direct contempt without a formal hearing." I stayed quiet. I knew there was more. He continued, "Reynolds versus State and Parker versus Hudson both address contempt rulings issued without immediate oversight. In those cases, the courts determined that due process was required because the judge was not present to witness the alleged violation firsthand." A pause. But in this case, I was present. Calloway leaned back slightly, just enough for me to notice. He thought this was the end of it, that Robertson had made up his mind. But I wasn't done yet. I folded my hands on the table. "Your Honor, with respect, your presence in the courtroom does not override my right to respond before a fine is issued." Robertson's fingers tapped lightly against the bench again. That same small habit he had when he was thinking. I went on. "In Bloom versus Illinois, the Supreme Court ruled that even in cases of direct contempt, punishment cannot be imposed arbitrarily. The accused must be given a meaningful opportunity to defend themselves before any financial penalty is enforced." I let that sink in. Robertson didn't react right away. I could hear faint murmurs from the audience again, people shifting in their seats. Then Robertson inhaled, slow and deep. "Are you suggesting that I acted arbitrarily, Mr. Vance?" I held his gaze. "I'm suggesting that you acted before allowing me a fair chance to defend myself." The weight of the room shifted. I could feel it. Calloway shifted in his chair, his fingers tightening on his pen. Robertson leaned back. He wasn't tapping his fingers anymore. He was still considering. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Uncertainty. Then, after a long pause, he spoke again. "Very well," he said. "Mr. Vance, you will be given an opportunity to present your full argument before this court makes a final ruling on the fine." Calloway sat up straight. "Your Honor, with all due respect." Robertson raised a hand. "The court will hear him out." A hush fell over the room. This wasn't over. It was just the courtroom was dead silent. No one moved, no one coughed, no one even seemed to breathe. Everyone was waiting for me to speak. Judge Robertson sat with his hands folded, his expression neutral but stiff. Calloway had one elbow on the table, his fingers resting against his chin, but his eyes told the real story. He was watching me like a man try to predict a storm. I took a slow breath. "Your Honor," I began, keeping my voice steady, "this case is not just about a fine. It's about the fundamental principle of due process. The right to be heard before being punished. The right to a fair system that does not change depending on who is in the judge's chair." Robertson's eyes flickered slightly. He knew where I was going. I continued. "If this court rules that a financial penalty can be imposed without allowing the accused to defend themselves, it sets a precedent, one that could allow any judge in any courtroom to punish without process." A few people in the audience exchanged glances. This was bigger than just me. They could see it now. Robertson exhaled slowly. "Are you arguing that my ruling could be considered judicial overreach?" I didn't hesitate. I'm arguing that if this ruling stands, it would contradict the very foundation of our legal system. Calloway scoffed, shaking his head. Your Honor, this is grandstanding. I turned to him. Is it? He met my stare, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He knew I was making sense, even if he didn't want to admit it. I looked back at Robertson. Your Honor, the Supreme Court has repeatedly held that due process is not a privilege. It's a right. And if we ignore that right here, then we have to ask ourselves, where does it stop? Robertson didn't answer right away. His fingers tapped the desk. Once. Twice. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. Mr. Vance, do you believe this fine should be overturned entirely? I let the silence stretch for just a moment before answering. I believe that if a penalty is issued, it must be done lawfully. If this court believes I have violated procedure, then I will accept the consequences. But only if those consequences are reached through a fair process. The weight of my words hung in the air. Robertson looked down at his notes, flipping a page before setting his pen down. He leaned forward slightly. This court will take this matter under review. Calloway's head snapped toward him. Your Honor. Robertson held up a hand, silencing him. The court will reconvene tomorrow for a final ruling. He struck his gavel. The session was over. But this fight was far from finished. The next morning, I walked into the courthouse knowing that everything hinged on what would happen in the next few hours. The halls were quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that comes when people are waiting for something big to happen. Even the usual chatter from attorneys and clerks felt subdued. As I stepped into the courtroom, I could feel the weight of every set of eyes turning toward me. Judge Robertson was already seated at the bench, flipping through his notes with slow, deliberate movements. Calloway sat at the prosecution's table, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming softly against the wood. I took my seat. Robertson cleared his throat. Court is now in session. The murmurs in the room died instantly. He set his notes down and folded his hands in front of him. His expression gave nothing away. After reviewing the arguments presented yesterday, I have come to a decision regarding the fine imposed on Mr. Vance. A pause. A long one. I held my breath. Robertson exhaled. The fine will not be enforced. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Some people looked shocked. Others nodded, as if they had expected this outcome all along. But Robertson wasn't finished. However, he said, raising his voice slightly to regain order, this does not mean I find Mr. Vance's conduct beyond reproach. I stayed silent. He turned his gaze directly toward me. While I acknowledged that due process was not fully adhered to, I also recognize that courtroom decorum is critical. A lawyer's duty is not only to argue the law, but to respect the authority of the court while doing so. I nodded slightly. I had won the legal argument, but I knew when to let a judge have the last word. Calloway, however, wasn't ready to let this end quietly. He stood abruptly. Your Honor, if the fine is being overturned, what precedent does that set? Are we allowing attorneys to challenge court rulings without consequence? Robertson narrowed his eyes slightly. Mr. Calloway, are you suggesting that a lawyer should be penalized for ensuring the law is applied correctly? Calloway hesitated, just for a second. Then he shook his head. No, Your Honor. I'm suggesting that this ruling may encourage unnecessary challenges to judicial authority. Robertson leaned forward slightly. Judicial authority is not above the law, Mr. Calloway. It is bound by it. Calloway clenched his jaw, but said nothing. Robertson straightened. This matter is now closed. He struck the gavel. The case was over. I had won, but as I looked at Calloway's face, I knew this wasn't the last time I would be fighting this kind of battle. And something told me he knew it too. The courtroom was empty now. The voices that had filled it just minutes ago were gone, leaving only the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I stood near the defense table, gathering my papers, but my mind wasn't on them. I had won. The fine had been overturned. The law had been upheld. But something about the way Judge Robertson had delivered his ruling stuck with me. I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. You got lucky, Calloway said, his voice sharp but quieter than before. I turned to face him. Luck had nothing to do with it. He scoffed. You think this changes anything? You embarrassed a sitting judge, made him second-guess himself in open court. You think people in our profession are going to cheer for you. I studied him for a moment. His usual arrogance was still there, but there was something else underneath it now. A frustration he was trying to hide. Maybe even doubt. I took a step closer. I didn't come here to make friends, Calloway. I came here to make sure the law was followed. He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. The law? The law is more than words on a page, Vance. It's relationships. Power. Who's willing to fight and who's willing to back down. I kept my voice steady. Then maybe more people should be willing to fight. He stared at me for a long moment, then sighed, shaking his head. You don't get it yet, but you will. And with that, he turned and walked out. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of everything settle in. The victory was real, but Calloway wasn't wrong. There would be consequences. There always were. I finished gathering my things and stepped out into the hallway. Reporters had already started clearing out, but a few lingered, waiting to catch any last comments. As I walked past, one of them called out, "Mr. Vance, do you think this ruling sets a new precedent?" I stopped, thought for a second. Then I looked at him and said, "I think it reminds people that even judges have to follow the law." And with that, I walked away, knowing this was just the beginning. Thank you for listening to another exciting story from VIP Vault. If you have enjoyed listening to this story, check out our videos here.